Good morning. Hopefully everybody can hear me. We only have like a minute till we're supposed to start, so hopefully you can hear me. Let me know if you can't. Thomas, I just made you host so you can let people in. And I'm gonna have you kind of watch the chat too a little bit. I'll be watching it too, but just help me with the chat a little bit.
Okay, sounds good.
And let me share my screen. It's a little bit of a rainy Friday. I'm gonna miss the sun, you guys. Okay. Okay, you're here for an appraisal class. I really like this class. There's lots of good information here, and hopefully you guys will participate. That makes it a lot better. Let's see. Thomas, you're gonna have to let me share the screen again. Oh, you did. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay.
Okay, there we go. Okay. Somebody tell me what's going on with rates. What are you hearing about rates? Who do you guys follow? How do you guys keep track of what's going on with rates? I know that's my job, but you as agents probably want to know a little bit about what's going on with rates when people ask you to. Who's brave? My emails. Thank you, Richard. I like that answer. Okay, I do send out rate emails on Tuesdays that talk about the rates, talk about, that day, what's going on. I follow a guy named Hammer. You're welcome to get his emails too, um, but yeah, just kind of keep an idea in your head about what's going on with rates. Know that when the Fed drops their rates for the interest rate that they loan to banks, that doesn't necessarily correlate exactly to mortgage rates. And so just kind of keep that in mind. A lot of times we're already pricing in rate drops by the feds. And so that's kind of how that happened. We did see a little bit of drop in rates with the Fed meeting in September, but it wasn't for very long. So I'm still seeing good rates though. Okay. We're seeing 6.5 or lower on conventional with good credit and mid fives for FHA, which for those of you who've been in the business for a little while, that's a good rate. And I know higher rates and higher prices make it hard for people to buy, but we do have good rates. So don't blame rates for not having deals. People are buying right now and stay positive. Okay, let's talk about appraisals. I know there's a lot of things with appraisals that we as agents and lenders sometimes wonder and scratch our heads at. Remember, appraisers sometimes have big egos. So tread lightly when we work with appraisers, and hopefully we can make things happen when we need to. Okay, if you've been to any of my other classes, you can scan this QR code. I'll put it up again too, but you can scan it right now. And then I'll be giving 5 keywords throughout the class. This is a 2-hour class. We'll be ending at 11:40 because we can take 10-minute breaks per hour. And so I usually just tack those on at the end and nobody has complained. So we'll be ending at 11:40. Please scan this. Please, at the end of the class, don't say I didn't know I was supposed to keep track of the words. If you miss one word for some reason, don't stress. You only need to give me 4 to get credit. Okay. So I'll put this back up again and we'll talk about this again. But yeah, either scan it now and enter your words or write them down and then enter them later. You can also email me if for some reason the QR code isn't working. Just include your license number. We can look it up, but it's nice not to have to. Okay. Um, so we talk in these classes a little bit about the reasons why we have rules for appraisals. And we had some problems in 2008 and 9, if any of you were in the business then, with the independence portion of appraisals, meaning that people were giving money to appraisers to appraise for certain values or saying they wouldn't pay them if it didn't appraise, or using appraisers to pull money out of houses. And so they've tightened up on those. I don't talk to appraisers. So if you call me and you have something going on with the appraiser, I'm not going to be the one to talk to them. I do have an assistant who talks to the appraiser for me, but I try to maintain independence from the appraiser. You, as agents, however, can talk to the appraiser. So don't be scared to talk to the appraiser. Don't be scared to show up if you feel like there's a reason to talk to them about something specific about a specific house. We've done classes with appraisers and they're happy to meet with you and they're happy to have you talk to them. They ask that you don't take hours of their time, but at the same time, if there's a reason why you need to talk to them, they can talk to you. And we're going to talk a little bit more in this class about what happens when appraisals come in low and what you can and cannot do, or what you should and shouldn't do. So again, I don't get to pick the appraiser. We have an independent company. We use Mercury. There's other companies, but basically it goes into a pool. We order the appraisal, and then one of it goes to different people on whatever. Let's say that appraiser one, it's his turn next. Goes to him. If he can't do it, it goes to the next person. But I'm not going to be able to pick. Now we do have appraisers that we like. Some of them get their information back to us quicker, and some of those kinds of things, but I can't ever pick which appraiser I'm using. And you can't either. We'll talk a little bit about when you can get a second appraisal and how that works too. Okay, so here's some requirements per Fannie Mae. The appraiser has to be licensed by the state where the property is located. Sometimes we'll have appraisers who are out of state, but their company has to be licensed here. We'll talk about VA loans and FHA loans and some of those kinds of things that are a little bit different sometimes with our appraisers. Lenders must provide the borrower a copy of the appraiser prior to closing. Our company now just sends it directly to them. As soon as it comes in, it goes directly to the borrower. And it used to be that we had to send it, but now they're making us just immediately send it to the borrower. So the borrower will get a copy of it pretty quickly. Now, if I'm on the buyer's side, I don't have to tell the seller anything about the appraisal. The appraisal is the buyer's, and I'm going to ask my buyer's agent before I say anything to the sellers about anything on the appraisal or the amount. Why would that be a big deal? Why do we want to be careful?
You don't, especially if it appraises higher, you don't want to tip your cards on that if something comes back later.
Correct. Right. So do you have less negotiation tactics with your due diligence and some of those other things if they know that it appraised for 50,000 more than what they're selling it for, right? And so we want to be careful that we don't tip our cards, like you said.
My
Sometimes
standard answer was always it came in at value.
exactly. And that's what I usually say. And I always ask my buyer's agent before I even say anything. But yeah, it came in at value, came in at what we needed. We don't have to tip our cards there. Um, yeah, so just be careful that you keep your negotiations for your buyers, that you're remembering that you're on their side. And so anything with the appraisal, try to not tip our cards. Good. Um, we'll talk a little bit later about what happens when it comes in low. If it comes in high, we're fine, right? And we're happy. I just had one yesterday come in $50,000 high. I haven't seen that for a long time. So that's good for our buyers, right? And they've got some due diligence things that they want to talk about. So yeah, we're not going to talk about how much over asking or how much over the contract price the appraisal came in. Loan officers cannot choose or have contact with their appraisers. I can talk to an appraiser, but I can't specifically talk about a specific appraisal, if that makes sense. So, like, I can call my appraisers that I know. I have phone numbers for appraisers, and I can ask them things, but I can just do general things and not specific about values. There has to be a clear-cut line of independence between the appraiser and the other parties, and that's what appraiser, the, that's what the rules are for. And I'm not seeing problems that way. I'd be curious if anybody has seen any problems, but our appraisers are pretty good, and we very rarely have to make any complaints about them. You cannot attempt to influence the development, reporting, result, or review of an appraiser. through coercion, extortion, collusion, compensation, inducement, intimidation, bribery, or in any other manner, including but not limited to. Okay, so just be super careful. This is pretty self-explanatory, but be careful. I know sometimes when, especially people are worried about VA and FHA appraisals, and so, but be really careful with how you talk and treat appraisers. And we'll talk about sometimes when it can be really frustrating. Okay, so these are kind of things that we know we have to be careful of. We need to be careful how we talk to appraisals. The appraisal management companies, that's what these companies are. Mine, again, is called Mercury. There's a number of them out there. They're not all created equally, but basically, the only way we can get an appraiser out of that, if we are having problems with an appraiser, is to show that there's been some problems and complaints, and it's kind of a whole process. And so I love that, I don't have to do that very often and that we have a really good pool of appraisers. There's lots of fraud stories. You can go look those up. Problems that happen when there isn't independence with appraisals. And there's a lot of those. I'm sure there still are some, sadly, but I think it's helped this independence rule that we have. Okay, let's talk about the appraisal process. A lot of this you guys know. Feel free to interrupt me and ask any questions. We'll get to some different scenarios and that will help with discussion more. But um, if an appraisal requires an interior inspection, an appraiser will contact a homeowner. Most of the time, the appraiser is going to need to go in the house. Okay. We had some times during COVID where they did appraisals without going in the house. My brother, when he refinanced his house, he has a lot of issues with his immune system, and they did allow him to send pictures to the appraiser. This was for a refinance, and they didn't go in his house. So during COVID, we did have some times with that, but for the most part, they're going to go in the house, they're going to take pictures, and they're going to do an inspection. Now, our appraisers, roofers, are appraisers foundation guys? Are they water guys? So we need an inspection on top of an appraisal, right? And you as buyer's agents are going to recommend that they get an inspection. But sometimes appraisers will see something that they don't have the knowledge to say yes or no on, and they'll require somebody else to come in and look at it. So yesterday we got an appraisal back. It's a flat roof and there was a little bit of pooling water, and the appraiser just said, I want a roofer to come in and just double check that there's no issues here. So you may see stuff like that, and I appreciate it when appraisers do that. If they see something that they're concerned about, let's just have another somebody come in and just make sure. Now I had an appraisal done that didn't have that, and there was a water issue, and it caused a lot of problems later, right? So if they see something that even if it's been fixed, I've seen appraisers call out, it looks like there's been some water damage here. Let's just have somebody come in and double check this. So there's pros and cons to that, but in this case, before we can close on this house now, we need a roofer to come in and pass off on this roof that there's no problems, because the appraiser called it out. An appraiser will research county and municipal records. Sometimes the MLS doesn't have the correct information on there. Who's seen a condo listed as a townhome or vice versa? So sometimes it's not correct on there, right? And they're going to go ahead and research that and tell us. I've even had appraisers call me and say, this is a condo or vice versa. And we have to go and like kind of argue a little bit, because do condos always look like condos? Right? We think of a condo as what? More of an apartment style, right? But sometimes we'll have a row end looking townhome style that is actually a condo. So be careful of that when you're doing listings, because there are differences with condos than there are with townhomes. What are some of those? Let's just talk about those real quick. What issues can we have with, Richard says too many times, yeah. So I'm thinking of a specific issue that I had as a lender, and I always like to talk about it in this. Okay, insurance. So sometimes there's different insurances. Good. What else?
If you're working with FHA, you've got certifications to worry about.
Good. Thank you, Tana. So FHA and VA both have to be approved for condos. Okay. So sometimes the project is approved, sometimes it's not. There is a chance you could get a spot approval, but there's a lot of things that you have to have happen to get the spot approval done. So yeah, you're going to be worried if you have a VA or an FHA borrower with a condo. Is it approved? Are we going to be able to go through? Good. What else? What's something that could happen even with a conventional loan in condos?
The too many renters or investors.
Good, good. Okay. And sometimes one person owning more than 10% can cause problems with a conventional loan too. So they're called non-warrantable condos, and sometimes they really can only be cash or seller financing. So I ran into that problem where it looked like a townhome, it was listed as a townhome, it was listed that it could go conventional or cash. So they knew that it wasn't going to be able to go FHA or VA, but it said conventional or cash. But the HOA was under construction. So it was an older part, but they were building a newer part, and the whole HOA was together. So that's another reason if it's under construction. So just be careful with condos and townhomes. Just make sure you know if it is a condo. It's really easy for me to look it up on the county records. You guys can do that too, but I'm happy to do that anytime if you have one and you're like, can you just double check if this is a condo? Can you double check if it's FHA or VA approved? And VA and FHA are different. So if it's FHA approved, don't assume that it's VA approved and vice versa. They have different websites and different approvals, so you do have to double check. Okay. Any other questions about condos? Just be a little bit more aware. You do have to get condo approvals and condo docs, um, and just make sure. Another thing that I like to tell my agents is be super careful. So me as the lender, I always make sure that my buyers when they have like high deductibles on their master policies that I talk to them about an HO6 policy, which is like a renter's policy. Super important if they don't need insurance for their loan, but so it won't be escrowed, but they usually have a high deductible. It can be up to $25,000. And so if a lender isn't recommending or you aren't recommending that they look into an HO6 policy, then down the road, if they have a claim, they may be liable for that $25,000 deductible. And that can be really frustrating to our buyers because they don't understand that. So just be aware. I always do that, but just double check with your buyers that their lenders are talking to them about HO6 policies with townhomes and condos. Okay. Um, an appraisal will review recent sales and listings of comparable properties. You'll see that in the appraisal, and we'll kind of go through that a little bit. You as agents, probably most of the time you're going to be looking, and I always send to my buyer's agent the appraisal as soon as it comes back so that they have a copy of it because I don't go out and see the properties, right? And so I'm counting on you guys if there's some issue with the appraisal, like coming in low or something like that, to look and see if there's any problems with square footage, any problems with the number of bathrooms or number of bedrooms or the land size or any of those things that might have been a mistake that would cause the lower appraisal that we can worry about. So look through your appraisals for your buyers. Just make sure everything looks kosher. Usually we're just looking at as is and if it came in at value. And if those two things happen, we're usually okay. If there's anything from the appraiser that needs to be fixed, then we have to work on that too, and we'll talk about that. An appraiser may use the sales comparison approach to develop an opinion of value, often the primary approach to develop an opinion of value for residential property, the sales approach comparison. So basically they've got to have some comparables or else they can't justify it. And we'll talk about some things like ADUs that are pretty common right now. Fannie and Freddie both will allow ADUs. 75% of the projected rent on the ADU can be added to your income. So both Fannie and Freddie, it used to just be Freddie would do that, but now both of them are. But we have to make sure that if you're looking at an ADU property for your client, one of the important things to note is that if the appraiser can't find any other properties around that have ADUs to compare, then that can cause a problem. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a legal ADU, meaning licensed by city. It just has to be in an area that allows ADUs. So if if you go in to offer on a property and it's not in an area that does allow ADUs, you're not going to be able to use that income because the appraiser is going to note that it's not a legal place for an ADU. So just be careful. There are a lot of things like that that we need to know and worry about when we're making offers for our clients. So then we have a cost approach. Lastly, an appraiser may utilize the income approach. There's different approaches. Typically, we'll see the same ones and we'll talk about those. Frequently asked questions. Let's go over some of these. Why is an appraisal necessary? What are we trying to do here? I know some of you have been in the business forever, and this may seem like a crazy question, but what are we trying to accomplish with an appraisal? Third-party evaluation. Thanks, Richard. Why do we need it? If somebody says, well, I'm willing to pay for this much for it, why do we need an appraiser to tell us?
Because the lender needs to know that that it's secured, but that the property is worth at least what they're securing for it.
Good, good. And it's interesting when we talk about worth, use that word, right? Because what does an appraisal tell us? Doesn't really tell us how much it would cost to rebuild it, right? It just tells it what it would sell for. So what is in this market, what is a reasonable amount that it's going to sell for? And that's why we have these comps. Something else sold for this amount and it's got this many bedrooms or it has this, and they kind of compensate for pros and cons to each property to try to get an idea. Okay, this is the value of what this should sell for. What happened in 2019 with values? What were people doing in 2019 to get into a house? 2020.
Offering over value, paying the
Yeah,
difference.
good. Getting rid of our due diligence, making earnest money go hard immediately. I had one client that paid $100,000 over appraisal. So that was a crazy time. And part of the problem in that time, what was something that was going on there? Let's talk about that because this is an interesting thing. During that time, what was happening to prices of what the values of properties? Right now, we're not seeing people pay over appraisal. Has anybody seen anybody pay over appraisal? I'm not seeing that at all. Okay. But what's the difference now than back then? Why was that happening so much?
The demand was there.
Supply
You
and
had to
demand,
pay
yeah.
over appraisal.
Okay. So there was a demand and right, like the comps weren't necessarily keeping up with what people were willing to pay. And so the comps weren't coming in there. Once people started paying higher, then you have a comp now, right? That somebody paid higher. And so then they start to kind of go up and the appraisals start to kind of keep in line with what the demand was. Yeah. So I mean, I think I did a refinance for a friend at the beginning of 2020 and at the end, and her property value was $100,000 higher. And she didn't really change anything. It wasn't like she had huge upgrades or anything like that. So it was kind of a crazy time, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the value wasn't there. It's just that you couldn't find comps, right? And so people were like, well, I want to get into this house. And there was how many people offering, right? If you guys were making offers for buyers in that time, sometimes there were 40, 50 offers on a property. And those sellers agents have to go through and figure out who's the best one. It was a crazy time. So we do have things like that that happen, but we do need an appraisal for the lender to be able to say, yes, this is the value. What about appraisal waivers? I'm not seeing those as much either, but we did have one the other day. What about appraisal waivers, Ron?
I haven't run into it.
You haven't had appraisal waivers lately, but what do they do? Do you know about appraisal waivers?
Since I haven't really been involved with it, I don't know if it relates to drive-bys or how it's done exactly.
Yeah, so Fannie and Freddie have, every time there's an appraisal, it's logged into a huge database. Okay, and Fannie and Freddie will sometimes, when I run on my digital underwriting system, they'll sometimes accept the value based on all that data that's in their system. And so we usually see it when we have a huge down payment. So let's say we've got 35, 40% down, and then, Fannie and Freddie say, that's fine, we accept the value that you're asking for. And so we don't have to do an appraisal, and it's called an appraisal waiver. Now, back in 2020, when, we were making lots of offers, people loved appraisal waivers. Why? Why was that a huge deal?
Because it's faster. You don't have to wait.
That's true. And we weren't worried about the appraisal coming back low, right? That's what was happening back then. A lot of times is the appraisal was coming back in low, and then people had to negotiate how much they were willing to pay over appraisal. So yeah, you don't have to worry about that value. So sometimes back then I would have people text me when they were making an offer, put in the address, run in my digital underwriting system, see if we got an appraisal waiver, and then their offer would say we waive our appraisal um, deadline because they knew that they had an appraisal waiver. So you don't have to worry about that appraisal coming in low and people not having enough money. And it made your offer stronger to your sellers because they didn't have to worry about it either. Um, okay, but it's usually when you have a large down payment that you'll get those. I don't see them with 5 and 10% down usually. Sometimes even 20, they won't give it to me now. Okay. The lender orders the appraisal to obtain an accurate description of the property and an independent opinion of value, which we said. The lender uses the appraisal to document that the real estate is appropriate collateral and determine whether the value of the property is sufficient to support the lending decision. So it's just to give us something so that we can say, okay, this makes sense to loan on this property, this much money. Why isn't the consumer considered to be the client when he or she pays for the appraisal fee? I always say that it is the buyer's appraisal. But they pay for it in their closing costs. Um, but basically, we're getting that for the lender. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the lender is the client because they're the ones that are protecting their investment.
Right, right. Federal banking regulations require the financial institution to be the client regardless of who pays the fee. So the client is the buyer is paying that fee as part of their closing costs usually, unless for some reason I'm paying it. Um, And then, we have the appraiser, they research market data, public records. We talked about this, talks with the buyers, sellers, real estate brokers. Um, they look at leases, current leases. Whenever we're doing um, why can't that word come to me right now? Investment property. We're going to do a schedule of rents to see how much it rents for. There's so many different things that the appraiser is going to help us with. I've heard about problems with appraisers traveling long distance to appraise homes. How far is too far? So let's say you have a place down in um, Moab or, southern Utah or northern Utah. How far is too far to get an appraisal? The issue
Far
is
enough.
go ahead, Ron.
I was just gonna say, I mean, they need to be familiar with the area, and I've had issues with that in the past where they weren't familiar with a particular market.
Yep. And it can be a big deal, right? I mean, it can cause huge problems with the deal. Yeah, they definitely need to be familiar. And we do have problems with that sometimes, and that's when we have to talk to our appraiser and figure things out, and we'll talk about some of those issues. The issue isn't so much the distance or how far is too far, rather the question that should be asked is an appraiser from outside of my area competent to appraise the property? So what Ron's saying, do they know about this market? Do they understand this market? Some appraisers work in many geographic areas and are knowledgeable and competent in all of them. Other appraisers have a limited range in which they normally appraise, and they may not have the data or the experience to be competent outside their local market. So we don't necessarily get to decide this because of the way that the independent rules are, right? So I put this, whatever address this is, into um, my appraisal rotation, and then we get an appraiser who accepts it. I'm hoping that the person who accepts it knows that market, right? Ideally, they turn it down if they don't know that market, but that's not something I can always guarantee. Okay, we talked about that, what they do. They'll go in, they'll do the sizes, they'll look at all the upgrades. If there are certain upgrades that you want them to consider, you can leave a little note for them. I have had appraisers say that they do look at those, but it doesn't necessarily make it a huge difference, right? Sometimes they can give value for those kinds of things, and sometimes they can't. It just depends on the comps that they can pull. So we want to make sure we do call, sometimes we use the word inspection interchangeably, but an appraisal and a home inspection are very different things. And I just want to go over those differences. Basically, we want both of those, right? And an appraiser is just trying to give value. He's not gonna, unless he sees something like we talked about at the beginning, like pooling water on the roof or something where he can tell, um, my computer is telling me it's gonna sign out. If it signs out, I'll be right back on. Stay there. Don't stress. But I I don't know. It just says your IT support provider has initiated a reboot of this device. So I promise I'll be back. Stay on if for some reason my computer turns off. I don't know what's going on. Um, but basically the appraiser is going to go out and try to give value. But if they're not a roofer, like I said before, they're not a plumber. They may see some things that are obvious, but we want to have an inspector come in and look at those things as well. And you will see appraisers call out those straps on the water heater. I see that a lot. So as listing agents, if you see that there aren't straps on the water heater, you might want to just put those on so that we don't have to have the appraiser come out 2 times for something like that that we know that they're almost always going to call out. Um, they'll call, if they see something like water damage that has been, even if it's been repaired, it's not currently wet, they may say, you might want to, have somebody come in and make sure that this is taken care of. So we do see things, stair railings, that's another thing they call out. And FHA, they'll call out peeling paint. So if you have an FHA borrower and or if you put that it's FHA approved, just know that if you have peeling paint, even on a shed, we had one on a shed that was going to be torn down. It didn't matter. We just spray painted it and they were okay with it. But the appraiser did call it out as you have to do something about it. And be careful because if you go out as the listing agent or the buyer's agent to try to help with some of these things, if there's paint chips, like if you're getting it prepared to paint and you get paint chips all over the ground, they're going to want those picked up. So put out a tarp and so that you don't have to pick up all those paint chips. Just know that there may be a few extra things for FHA, but I'm not seeing egregious amounts for FHA.
Will they raise those concerns about paint even on houses built after 78?
They do. Yeah, sometimes I'll see them any kind of peeling paint, even on, and I mean maybe there hasn't been peeling paint because I don't go out to the site, so I don't know, right? But but they usually say peeling paint. I mean, and then like on that one, we just spray painted it. But you're right. Now, Ron's asking that question because of lead-based paint. So any houses built before 1978, we have to have a lead-based paint disclosure. And doesn't necessarily mean there is lead-based paint in that property. We just have to have the disclosure that so that people understand there can be problems with lead-based paint. So yeah, I mean with FHA, sometimes it's just like, are they gonna call it? Are they not? And okay. It says it's gonna shut down in 2 minutes. You guys, please just wait, and I'll be back on as soon as I can if it does. Um, yeah, so be careful of FHA and lead-based paint. The handrails, there's another thing and decks. Sometimes the peeling paint on decks has to be fixed. So just be careful. Why are people so worried about FHA appraisals? Sometimes because of repairs. What else? We're not having this problem as much now, but back when we were talking about values going up super quickly, that was a huge concern for FHA. Why would a seller be worried about FHA? They stick with the property. Thank you, Pamela. Okay, 6 months, it's going to stick with the property. Right now, do we think that property values are going to go up a ton in 6 months? We don't know for sure. Maybe, maybe not. But that value stays only if the next buyer is FHA. So let's say you have an FHA appraisal, it comes in a little bit low. You decide not to go with that buyer. That appraisal sticks with the property for 6 months if you sell to an FHA buyer. If you sell to a conventional buyer, you can get a new appraisal and it doesn't. So keep that in mind. But that back in that time when appraisals were going up $100,000 in a year, that's going to be a big deal for them because they're not going to be able to sell to an FHA buyer then. And so it would limit the people that could buy their house, right? Um, so that was a big deal back then, and it was really hard to get under contract if you were VA, FHA, or Utah Housing in those times. VA does not stick with the property like FHA does. That's a great question. Okay, so that's why sellers are worried about FHA sometimes. I feel like